All right. Hi, everybody. This is John Moss. I am with the staff of the National Museum of the U.S. Army, located at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. And we have one of our book talk series today with author and journalist Steve Vogel, who has written a wonderful book called Betrayal in Berlin. But before we get into that, let me introduce Steve. Steve Vogel is the author of Through the Perilous Fight and The Pentagon, A History, both published by Random House. He's a reporter for the national staff of the Washington Post who covers the federal government and frequently writes about military and veterans. Based overseas from 1989 through 1994 and reporting for the Post and Army Times, Steve Vogel covered the fall of the Berlin Wall and the First Gulf War, and subsequently reported on military operations in Somalia, Rwanda, the Balkans, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Vogel also covered the September 11th attack on the Pentagon and its subsequent reconstruction. So we're happy to have him here to talk about his most recent book, Betrayal in Berlin, the true story of the Cold War's most audacious espionage operation. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks for having me, John. It's a real honor.
Great. Well, I'm a big fan of the book, and I read it very closely, so I can keep up with you as you talk. But we basically have here what is, in essence, a Cold War story, early Cold War, really. Where the U.S. and its allies and NATO faced off against the Soviet Union, and in this particular scenario, the East Germans also, and their partners. So can you kind of fit this episode into a broader picture of the Cold War so folks know how to contextualize it?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's important to remember that this was really a uniquely vulnerable point in American post-war history. We were now, close to a decade past the end of World War II, and the United States was really in a uniquely vulnerable position after being such a dominant power for in the years after World War II with the nuclear weapon, of course. The Soviets, of course, had subsequently exploded their own weapon in 1949, and they also were maintaining a very large conventional force in Eastern Europe, much larger than the Western counterparts had in terms of military force. And we were also vulnerable in terms of intelligence, because this was, of course, before the U-2 was flying, before, of course, satellites were able to gather intelligence for us. And moreover, in terms of human intelligence, we weren't having a lot of luck. The young CIA was at that point fairly thoroughly outmatched by the KGB. We'd had a really good program called Venona that the Army Security Agency had been running towards the end of World War II and in the first years after the end, that gave us we were able to intercept and decrypt Soviet radio communications. And this gave us a very good, important picture of Soviet military capabilities. But that had all come to a sudden end with what was known as Black Friday in 1948, when the Soviets had been tipped off about this operation by two spies, notably Kim Philby and William Weisband, who was an ASA employee. And so they changed their methods of communication. They shifted largely to a lot of to landlines, and they also changed their methods of encrypting conversations and teletypes. And so all of a sudden it was, more or less everything went black, and we were getting very little good intelligence. Mm-hmm. And one of the consequences was, complete surprise when the Korean War was launched. This was a war that was launched with Joseph Stalin's approval. Mm. And we also badly underestimated the capabilities of the Chinese Communist forces that would become involved in that fight. So the consequences were were pretty severe. And Dwight Eisenhower, after he comes into power in 1953, became very concerned that that the United States could face a nuclear Pearl Harbor. The Soviets, in fact, in 1953, exploded a hydrogen bomb, which was also well before we had anticipated that they'd be able to do that. And he was really concerned about the lack of good intelligence about Soviet military capabilities, and he was pretty much desperate for some way to get better intelligence, and that's kind of where Berlin comes in. The Berlin, of course, again, it's, we have to remember this is before the Berlin Wall was constructed. That wasn't until 61. But Berlin is still a divided city. But there's very easy access across the sector borders from the the four powers: the Soviets, Americans, the Brits, and the French. So people could go back and forth between East and West Berlin quite easily. On the subway, the U-Bahn, or the streetcars, or just walking, taking cars. It was it was very easy for people. This was really our best window into behind the Iron Curtain, because Berlin is positioned in the midst of East Germany. So it's like the one place where we could kind of find out what was going on. And equally importantly, it was also the communications hub for Eastern Europe, for a lot of Soviet-controlled Europe. So all communication lines tended to come into Berlin like the spokes on a hub, and this inspires the CIA, working in conjunction with the British Secret Intelligence Service, to contemplate the idea of building a tunnel. This isn't a tunnel, to escape Berlin, because there's no wall. It's a tunnel to tap into Soviet communication lines in Berlin, and that's kind of the genesis of this story.
Great. As we bring up our first image of President Eisenhower and Churchill, or at this time here, can you tell us a little bit more? You alluded to the CIA and the British intelligence, but how closely was the U.S. involved with the British on this operation?
Very closely. The British had done a similar operation in Vienna, which was also a divided city, and they had been able to construct some rather small tunnels because the Soviet communication lines went through the western sectors of Vienna, and had actually succeeded in picking up some good intelligence about the Red Army headquarters and military capabilities. And there was a thought that the British were thinking that this could be done on a much larger scale in Berlin, and the Americans were thinking the same things. Now, both sides were, for a while, more or less working independently on this idea, but there were a lot of reasons why they would ultimately need to work together. For the Brits, a big part of this was that this was going to be an enormously expensive operation, and Churchill was back in power as prime minister, returning for a final hurrah, and he's concerned about the lack of intelligence as well. But Great Britain is broke in the years after World War II, and they can't really support a really robust intelligence operation. But the Brits did have the technical expertise to pull off the massive tapping that would be needed, and the real technical skills. They had the people who could do that, both in the British SIS, but also in their post office. The British General Post Office had actually handled many of the very secretive tapping operations that the Brits have been involved with going back to World War II and afterwards. So they had the technical expertise, we had the money, and we both had the desire to get the intelligence. So before too long, it's agreed with both Eisenhower and Churchill signing off on this that CIA and SIS are going to work together to try to dig a tunnel in Berlin to tap into Soviet communication lines. And in order to do that, though, both the CIA and the British were going to need the help of the U.S. Army. And the U.S. Army in this whole project, its role is really enormous. In fact, I think you could say safely that the Berlin Tunnel could not have happened without the U.S. Army participation. Everything from providing cover for the operation to actually digging the tunnel. The Corps of Engineers, we can talk about this further, is brought in to dig the tunnel, and the Army also provides a lot of the translators for the material that's going to be needs to be translated, as well as other personnel to kind of operate this whole installation that they're going to create in Berlin. So it's a critical role that the Army plays.
Okay, thank you. Before we kind of get into the details, I want to bring up some slides here just to give the audience an idea of the scale and the scope and the look of the tunnel as we talk about it for a few more in a few minutes here. But here's the American compound, and can you just briefly tell us what we're looking at here? And
yeah, sure. This is a view from the eastern side, looking at an American warehouse compound that, as part of this project, has just been constructed in West Berlin. There's this area, an American sector known as Rudau, very rural area, not much happening down there. But the CIA had determined through espionage in the East German telecommunications ministry that the place where they could get the closest access to the trunk cables that are carrying Soviet communications from the Red Army would be down there in the very southern end of Berlin, near the American sector border with the Soviets. And so the Army leases this land, and they build what appears to be a warehouse. And in fact, it is a warehouse, but it's kind of a very unusual warehouse because they had decided that they would use this warehouse to cover the construction of a tunnel. If you're going to be pulling all this soil fill out of a quarter-mile long tunnel, which is what this tunnel would need to be, they were going to have to put it somewhere. If they start trucking it away from the site, very close, under a quarter mile from the Soviet border, you're going to very quickly be discovered, because you see all these trucks driving away from this site. And so they construct this warehouse, and then they decide to further disguise it by putting rather sophisticated antenna radar dishes, that sort of thing, on the roof. And it becomes officially a signal corps radar installation, where the idea is that this installation would be monitoring Soviet flights from the nearby Schönefeld airfield, which is where the Soviets came in and out of Berlin with their military aircraft. So it was a plausible explanation for this kind of odd-looking warehouse down in the southern portion of Berlin.
Okay, let's move to the next image, and this will give folks an idea of what the tunnel looked like from the inside. And these are Americans working on digging the tunnel. Is that right? Is that what we're looking at?
Yes, that's right. As I mentioned, the Army Corps of Engineers was brought in for this project, and I interviewed two of the captains, Army captains, who led the whole project, and they were pulled to the Pentagon and told that we're going to need your help to dig a tunnel. We can't tell you where it's going to be dug, but it has to be done in secret. And so these Army captains went through Army Corps of Engineer installations on the East Coast and put together a team of about 18 or 20 Corps of Engineers specialists, all with secret clearances. And they went out and trained in Sandia in New Mexico to kind of practice how they could dig a tunnel in secret, in quiet, which meant using entrenching tools. It's being hand dug. They couldn't just drill or blast a tunnel. Fortunately, this is pretty soft soil in Berlin, pretty sandy soil that they're going to be digging in. So, in fact, the bigger danger became a cave-in because it was so soft. And so they came up with this steel liner that they would place in the tunnel as they dug forward. So they had these 6-man teams digging 24 hours, from the basement of the warehouse. And almost immediately they ran into trouble in the form of water and sewage that they hadn't expected to run into, and they ended up having to dig this tunnel at a higher level than they had planned, and that increased the danger that the noise of the operation would be heard, or that the soil above the tunnel would begin sagging, and that would be a telltale reveal that there was something going on underneath the ground. So it was a very elaborate operation. They had an observation post in the warehouse where they had 24-hour guards watching the East German side, and anytime anybody wandered close to the tunnel site below, they would turn on these red lights that would flash down in the tunnel, and everybody would stop. They were going underneath the fields of a East German farmer, Farmer Nowak, who I interviewed his daughter about this, and he would occasionally hear these odd things. It seemed like he thought maybe they're coming from the warehouse, but it sounded like almost like a water pump, which is what it was. They had to pump out some of the water that they were running into down in the tunnel. So the other odd thing was that he was planting trees for an orchard, and a lot of them seemed to die, and he never could quite figure out what was going on with that. But this team of Corps of Engineers kept at it for 6 months around the clock, and starting in September of 1954, and by February of 1955, they had reached a point that they calculated was directly below this road, Schönefelder Chaussee in East Berlin, where the targeted cables ran just below the surface.
Let me stop you right there, because if we advance to the next image, I believe you'll be able to tell us what that is.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, those are the targeted cables. Those are the 3 trunk cables that the Americans and the British were trying to reach. And for this phase of the operation, reaching those cables, the American Corps of Engineers the team is just sent out back to the United States in the middle of the night, and they didn't even know this, that a British team, Royal Engineers, was coming in to do the actual tunneling up to reach these cables, and then the British postal team would come in to do the taps. So these 3 lines that we're looking at carried an enormous amount of Soviet traffic. Each was carrying 100+ circuits. So we're not talking about tapping a couple lines here or there. This is essentially thousands of communication lines, both voice telephone and teletype, that these lines are carrying, connecting the Soviet Red Army headquarters at Wunsdorf with facilities all across East Germany and Eastern Europe, as well as connections back to Moscow. So it was the real mother lode. And the Brits, by virtue of their experience, they brought in this device that was able to dig straight upwards through this very loose soil. It was very tedious, hard work, because there was constant danger that the entire lot above them would collapse on them. So they constructed this device that kind of looked like a cross between a Venetian blind and a barbecue grill that they used to sort of support the ground above as they tunneled up. And by April of '55, they had reached the cables, and in early May, the postal team went down there, and very intricate operation, because if they made any kind of mistake in trying to tap into these lines, it would have set off alarms. And I talked to one of the British intelligence guys who was down there while this was happening, and they were all convinced that at any moment a Soviet tank was going to just roll overhead and collapse the whole thing, because these cables were only 27 inches below the pavement of the road. So they were they were definitely hearing anything that went above them. If a horse-drawn wagon went over them, it just sounded like somebody was banging on their head with, a 2x4. So it was close quarters.
Okay, so we now have an overview of what it looked like and what the objective was of the British and the Americans to tap into those lines. But let's step back a little bit and talk about two personalities that are really key in your book. And I enjoy these sections probably the most because they're vivid descriptions and interesting characters. The first one is Bill Harvey that we see here. Now, from what I gather from reading the book, Steve, Bill Harvey really didn't seem to fit the mold of the typical American intelligence officer. He was kind of a larger than life figure, a little bit difficult to figure out sometimes, but extraordinarily dedicated to this mission. So can you tell us about him and what his role was?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Bill Harvey was really the key figure in creating this tunnel. But he was actually an FBI agent who had been working in New York as part of FBI teams that were working to break up the Nazi spy rings that the Abwehr, German intelligence, had operating in the United States during the war. And he was he was a pretty successful spy hunter. He had this rather extraordinary counterintelligence mind, where he could just put together two random pieces of information and see a connection that could lead to the crucial tip to break up a spy ring. And in fact, he was also, as an FBI guy, he didn't really fit into the our image of what a CIA officer would be. And what happened was he was fired from the FBI because of a couple of things that, including a heavy drinking incident. Harvey was the sort of guy who just threw down martinis like they were going out of style, and he wasn't one to necessarily follow all the rules that someone like J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, insisted on for his agents. So the young CIA, which was just being created about the time that Harvey was fired in 1947, was only too eager to have someone of his capabilities. Before leaving the FBI, Harvey had been part of the first team of first Soviet counterintelligence team in the United States. They had with the end of the war, they'd shifted their target to the Soviets, who were certainly operating a lot of espionage operations in the United States. And Harvey became the CIA's key guy in terms of counterintelligence, and he was also just a real clandestine operator. And he conceives of this idea of the tunnel along with Frank Rolette, who was a famous cryptographer who helped break the Japanese Purple Code during World War II and had left the NSA and joined the CIA. And Harvey and Frank Rolette more or less mastermind the American side of the tunnel. So he becomes the key figure that is sent to Berlin to become the chief of the Berlin CIA base. But what nobody knew, including most of the CIA officers at the base, was that his true mission was to oversee the creation of this tunnel to tap into Soviet communication lines.
Hmm. Well, we also have on the other side of things a very interesting character, probably the most interesting in my mind, is George Blake. And he was a very controversial individual, I guess you'd say, and some recent information we can share, or you can share with us at toward the end, so we don't give away too much of the story now. But can you tell us what George Blake's role was and where he started and how he ended up being one of the key figures to give information to the Soviets about what this tunnel was all about?
Oh yeah, well, yeah. The one of the disadvantages of working with the British on this operation was that it brings George Blake into the picture. And Blake was a pretty remarkable figure already, even at the start of this story. Um, he had grown up in Holland. His father had fought for the British Army during World War One, and his father had died, and his mother sends him to live for a while with relatives in Egypt. Um, and so he goes to school in Egypt. He comes back to Holland just as World War II is breaking out. He's a schoolboy, um, and he becomes a courier for the Dutch resistance after the Nazis invade Holland. And so he spends about a year doing that as a 13, 14-year-old boy, delivering messages, by bicycle or on trams, that sort of thing, but becomes fearful that he's going to be arrested by the Gestapo because A, he has a British passport, and B, he's half Jewish, and he decides he needs to escape. He makes his way across the continent of Europe, just in disguise, and makes his way crossing the snowy Pyrenees to Spain, um, makes it by ship to England, and he joins the Royal Navy. And very quickly, by virtue of the fact that he speaks a number of languages, he's had this very uh, elaborate experience working underground and in secret, and he gets recruited by British intelligence pretty quickly. And he is, by 1949, after successfully setting up a network to spy on the Soviets in the British occupied portions of Germany, he's sent to Korea to become the chief of the British intelligence station in South Korea. And he's there when the war breaks out, is taken prisoner. And at some point during his 3 years of captivity, about less than a year into it, he decides to change sides, and he makes an offer to speak to the KGB officers who have access to him, being held in this very far north of Korea, near the Chinese border. He's being held, by the way, with a number of U.S. GIs, and they've been subjected to the terrible conditions on a death march, and a number of the GIs had died during that time. But Blake makes the decision to switch to the other side, and when he returns to Great Britain in 1953, he's hailed as a hero, and he is assigned as his first job back to be the deputy at this very secretive British SIS office that is going to be overseeing the Berlin Tunnel, the British side of the operation. So he therefore becomes one of literally a handful. We're talking about 3 or 4 people in British intelligence who know about the plans for this tunnel. So he knows about it, and he's able to get word to his KGB handler in London before the first spadeful of soil from the tunnel is even dug. So it's kind of an astonishing plot twist in this whole story about what's going on with Blake. So the KGB is aware of this tunnel, and that, of course, opens up a lot of interesting questions and twists and turns and all that.
So let's go back to the tunnel itself, and the soldiers who were assigned to the warehouse and the Signal Corps unit. If I remember right, a lot of those guys that were serving in that area didn't always know, not all of them knew about the tunnel or what was going on, even though they were in the warehouses. There was quite a lot of elaborate secrecy by the U.S., right, Steve?
Oh, completely. Yeah, it was a very need to know based operation. So you had, because they had decided to use this as a radar installation, you had actual soldiers from the Signal Corps who were brought in to operate the radar dishes, and they did this sort of on the second floor of the warehouse. And most of these guys don't know that there's a tunnel beneath the surface. All the engineers, when they were digging the tunnel, they would wear Signal Corps insignia on their uniforms, and only a certain number of the soldiers who were brought in to help operate the collection of the intelligence were read into the project, and the first floor of the warehouse included this enormous operations room with about 150 of these big Ampex tape recorders. And once the taps were made in May of 1955, all of a sudden, the amount of information that they immediately are being inundated with. It was like they were a bunch of wildcatters in Texas, and they'd struck oil because they're just drowning in tape conversations. 1,000+ conversations, teletypes a day, and the CIA and the Army operate a forward processing station there in Berlin at the warehouse, where they're just they're putting on this set of headphones or that set of headphones and kind of listening to different conversations as they're being recorded. They're trying to get a feel for any sort of actionable intelligence, something that needs to be known right away. The prime being, of course, any indication of a Soviet surprise attack. This is the main thing that Eisenhower is worried about, and they're listening for anything like that. They're also listening for any indication that the Soviets know anything about the tap. So this installation, you have about 40 American soldiers there. Maybe at the most half of them know about the tunnel. Some of them kind of guess that something's going on. They see people, kind of, strange civilians that are wandering around the place. And, one soldier notices that, one guy seems to have a lot of sand on his pants, and, he's wondering what's going on down below the warehouse. But there's a Army lieutenant colonel in charge of the installation. He makes it clear that, if you're not in the project, you don't need to ask about the project. So, they were known around Berlin as being the spook brigade or spook unit down in Rudau. And, the Berlin brigade soldiers, infantry guys didn't, they saw these guys out at a bar or something, they might beat them up because they didn't act like real soldiers. And so there was some interesting tension going on.
Sure. So what actually was being tapped? What kind of information were the Americans getting? And was it useful? Was it kind of needle in a haystack, or was this really valuable?
It was a really, the best way to describe it is like it's a mosaic of information that was being developed. There isn't, any one big aha conversation or secret that they're pulling in. It's rather, it's a lot of conversations or teletype between like the logistics clerk at a Soviet Red Army installation near the border, sending stuff back, requesting, such and such equipment, or complaining that, the tire tracks on these tanks are falling apart. They're also getting a lot of general order of battle information, discovering the locations of some installations that they didn't even know about. They're learning about the type of equipment that the Soviets are stationing in East Germany or Poland, Czechoslovakia. They learn about a new, new fighter wings that are being put in to protect Soviet bombers. They're also getting information about the East German uranium mine, which is the primary source for Soviets' uranium for their nuclear weapons program. And they have the KGB office stationed down at Wismut in East Germany, at the mine there, is communicating with the KGB office in Berlin about what's going on there. So they're picking up intelligence about that, and they realize based on that the Soviets have capability for higher megaton weapons than had previously been thought. They're also getting intelligence about what's going on in the Kremlin, because there's a lot of the talk is just sort of seemingly like gossip. The Marshal Grechko, who was the commander of the group of Soviet forces in Germany, 5-star general marshal of the Red Army, his wife was, constantly complaining to people about different things, and they're picking up information about the personalities in the Kremlin, and they also learn about uh, Khrushchev's secret speech to the Soviet Party Congress in 1956. The first clues about what's going on comes from some of the conversations of people like Grechko and his wife, who were at the Party Congress, calling back to Berlin, talking about what was going on. So bit by bit, they're getting this mosaic put together of Soviet intentions, capabilities, and probably the most important thing that they get is the what they don't hear. They don't find any indication that the Soviets are preparing for any kind of surprise attack. They don't see like equipment being mobilized towards the border. They don't see like telephone lines being suddenly shifted forward. And this is a big relief. And that this, Eisenhower is worried that he might have to launch his own preemptive strike against the Soviets because he fears they're going to launch one against him. So it's kind of this critical information that gives Eisenhower confidence, that they don't have to worry about launching their own attack. So that at a time when we didn't have the U-2 or satellite intelligence, this is really important stuff.
So eventually the Soviets find out about this through Blake and his information, but they didn't rush in and reveal that or try to find the tunnel at all. They kind of sat on it for a while, for quite some time, if I remember correctly. Why did they sit on the knowledge that their communications were being tapped?
Well, in one word, it's Blake. Blake has immediately proven himself to be a spy of potentially enormous value. By this point, Kim Philby had more or less been outed as a spy, so they didn't have the great source of Philby anymore. In fact, it had been Bill Harvey, as an aside, who put together the case that Kim Philby was a spy. So they needed a new Philby. They needed somebody burrowed into Western intelligence, and Blake had every indication that he was a man on the rise. He was given this valuable position, and the information about the tunnel is so close hold, both at the CIA and with SIS, as well as the handful of Army people who know about it. But it's so close hold that if the Soviets do anything to block the tunnel, or even to shift communications away from these tapped lines, the investigation it's going to point to Blake in a real hurry, because Blake is one of only a handful of people who know about it. So when the KGB gets this information, we should remember that this isn't the whole KGB that gets it. Basically, we're talking about Ivan Serov, who is basically the leader of the KGB, and 2 or 3 others of his deputies who are told about the tunnel, and they decide that, you know what, we're going to keep this to ourselves. They don't inform the Red Army about it. Marshal Grechko in Berlin, the 5-star, learns nothing about the tunnel till much later. They don't even tell the KGB resident in Berlin, Pitovranov, about the tunnel initially, because if they do, if the Red Army starts shifting its communications off these lines, that's going to be a red flag that the tunnel has been betrayed. So their calculus is that, well, partly this is the KGB, and these are mostly Red Army lines that are being tapped. So they're, like bureaucracies, they're like, well, our secrets are safe. So, and they kind of issue these vague warnings to the Red Army. They say, you want to check your telephone security, and they reveal that their lines in Vienna had been tapped, and so there's kind of like this hint that this could happen somewhere else. But it doesn't do much good, because you have general officers on these lines who are not using the proper codes for conversations, and there's a lot of intelligence that is seeping out on these lines, and in fact, a lot more than the KGB realizes. That the KGB doesn't fully comprehend how much information, both in terms of the volume and in terms of the value, is being picked up by the Americans and the British. And part of the reason is that Blake has actually been sent to Berlin at this point, so he's no longer in a position to sort of oversee what's happening with the tunnel intelligence. Now he doesn't really have a need to know about the tunnel in this new position in Berlin. So ironically, even though he's closer to the whole tunnel operation, he is, cut off from information. So they let it go for 11 months. And for the last few months, they were trying to think of a way to do it. They're realizing, well, you know what, this has gone on long enough. We've got to come up with something. And in the end, they come up with this elaborate plan that involves waiting for bad weather to create short circuits in the telephone lines in Berlin, which happens periodically. And then they have a special team that is sent out to look for circuits. They don't know. This team doesn't know that they're looking for a tunnel, but they're kind of sent to the right place eventually, and the tunnel is discovered. So that the whole ruse of this being a accidental discovery is maintained, because literally the soldiers who dig up the tunnel don't know it's going to be there, so they are surprised, and the Americans are listening to this. So it was very elaborate, and it ends up protecting Blake. Blake, is certainly quite worried for a couple of months there after the tunnel's discovery that he's going to be outed, but in the end he was safe for years more.
So as we wrap up, let's talk a little bit about Blake. What happened to him, and how did he get to safety with the Soviets? And then he was in the news recently, and I understand you attempted to interview him. Can you tell us a little bit about your
absolutely. I actually did interview him twice during the research for my book. It's pretty amazing, because at the time I spoke to him, he was already 94 years old. And he did just die about in very end of 2020 at the age of 98. But Blake, he stays in position with SIS until he wants to get out. He's starting to feel pressure of being a mole. He's got a British wife and 2 children, and he's becoming more interested in his family than in spying, and he tries to find a way out of the espionage. But a Polish defector who was in military intelligence defects to the Americans in Berlin, and he has been providing warnings that MI6 or British SIS has been compromised, that there's a mole in there, and that this starts various investigations. And at first, Blake is found to be above reproach. There's no way that it could be George Blake, and so he's able to operate for another year or so. But finally, in 1961, they gather enough evidence. They bring Blake back from Lebanon, where he's been sent for a short time, and he confesses, and he's sentenced to the longest jail term in modern British civil history. But he's only held for 5 years before he manages a rather remarkable escape with the help of fellow prisoners. And after hiding out in London, he's smuggled back to Berlin, his old stomping grounds, and then the KGB whisks him back to Moscow, and he ends up living there for 60 years practically as an escaped spy. So pretty remarkable story.
Well, to wrap up, I want to ask you one final question. What you wrote a book about the Pentagon, you wrote a book about Washington, D.C. and the War of 1812, and then this was your next one. What got you interested in this subject?
Yeah, with all of them, I just feel like kind of a connection with the Pentagon. I was covering the Pentagon as a military base establishment as opposed to policy for the Washington Post. And I'd become familiar with its history. And when 9/11 took place, I ended up covering the attack on 9/11, and then also the subsequent reconstruction, the Phoenix Project. And that was it was a remarkable story. So I felt a connection to that with the War of 1812, which has been back in the news lately with stormings of the Capitol and so forth. Growing up in Virginia, Alexandria, living in DC and Maryland, I always felt like I knew a lot of Civil War history, but we knew very little about the War of 1812. And there's this remarkable invasion that leads to the capture of Washington. And so that's another local story that I felt a connection to. With Berlin, it was actually also a connection because my dad was actually a CIA case officer, and I was born in Berlin when he was stationed there. He was there from the late 50s through the early 60s when in fact, I was born just at the U.S. Army Hospital in Berlin. And, less than a year later, the Berlin Wall was put up. And my dad would always say that was no coincidence. They put it up to keep me out. So, and then I happened to be back again as a reporter covering for Army Times, U.S. Army in Europe. And I was there when the Berlin Wall came down. So I happened to be back for that. So I definitely felt this connection to Berlin as just this center of Cold War intrigue and just, kind of some remarkable stories that took place over the course of the Cold War up there.
Well, Steve Vogel, thank you very much for joining us today. Author of Betrayal in Berlin. I'm sure folks will really like to, once they see this just general overview, really get into the details because there's so much more to it. And the characters are fascinating. The story is remarkable. And congratulations on publishing it and all your hard work there. And we also thank you for joining us and sharing a little time to allow us to give our audience some Army history that they probably weren't aware of. So we appreciate it. Thanks very much.
Yeah, it was absolutely my pleasure, John. Thanks very much for having me.
Okay, have a good evening.
You too.